Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, the player review series continues. We'll talk about last year's second round pick, Jaylen Clark. Didn't see the floor at all this year. Could he actually earn a rotation spot this season for the Wolves? We'll also talk about the first round picks from a couple of years ago, Wendell Moore Jr. and Josh Minott. Same question for those guys. What's the future for them and the Wolves? It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Happy Thursday, everybody. And today we're going to continue the player review series. We did Luka Garza on whatever day that was, Wednesday. And, we're starting kind of at the end of the roster. We also talked about other two-way player for the Wolves this year, Daisha Nix. There we go, man. And now we're going to head into guys that were at least draft picks for Minnesota. So today it's Jaylen Clark, who I think is a really intriguing case. I'm excited to talk about Jaylen. We haven't had the chance to talk about him since probably last June, maybe July last year, as he was drafted just under a year ago. And then I want to talk about Josh Minott and Wendell Moore. Minott certainly is also an interesting case. Questions remain about if any of those three guys could be part of this team's rotation next year. So lots to get to. I have a lot to say about all of them, actually. So we'll get it right into that. First, so a big reminder or a big thank you, I guess, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. All right, let's go ahead and start with Jaylen Clark. Jaylen Clark was the Wolves' second round pick last year after Leonard Miller. Remember, the Wolves were able to move up to get Leonard Miller. They had a few people had Leonard Miller as a borderline lottery guy. I think Sam Vecini over at The Athletic had Leonard Miller there. We'll talk more about him probably tomorrow's show, actually. But their second round pick was Jaylen Clark. And the easiest way to start when we talk about Jaylen Clark is that he was widely seen as, before his Achilles injury in March last year, he was widely seen as a first round pick. A lot of mock drafts had him, at that point, early mock drafts, right before March Madness, because stuff changes then. A lot of places had him as a late first round pick. There was actually a quote, our guy Jack Borman had this last year following the draft, like immediately following the draft. Tim Conley said on draft night, quote, this is about Jaylen Clark. We're excited, super excited about Jaylen Clark. We had him as a high first round grade all year. And then later went on to call him, before the Achilles tear, said he was a solid first round grade. So the Timberwolves actually got two guys who they believed to be lottery picks in the second round last year. And both of them were often mocked kind of late first round. So Jaylen Clark, and the reason is because the point of attack defense more than anything else. So I want to be really clear about that. Like if you just pull up his numbers at UCLA, they're not super eye popping. He, his last year in college, he averaged 13 points a game, 48% shooting. That's fine. But he only shot 33% from three. For his career at UCLA, he played 29 plus games all 3 years. He only shot 30.2% from three. He didn't average a ton of assists. The scouting report's not going to tell you he's a great passer, but he does all the other stuff well. And those are, first of all, the type of guys that Tim Connolly likes. And second of all, the type of player this roster needs is somebody that does everything else well. So I'll talk a little bit about what I said last year when the Wolves drafted him, because it's been, like I said, almost a year. I compare what he did at the college level, especially defensively, to what Josh Minott did in his brief stint at Memphis at the collegiate level. He's obviously much smaller. He's 6'5". Josh Minott's 6'9". But Jaylen Clark's 6'5" with a 6'9" wingspan. And he's probably not quite as athletic as Josh Minott. Minott's really an athletic freak. But I would say he's a more polished guard version of Josh Minott. Jaylen Clark has an absolute nose for the ball. He's outstanding on defense on both on ball and off ball, which is huge, especially with this Wolves defense. That there's guys, I mean, Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns being the two most prominent examples, where they do fall asleep off ball a little bit. And I realize I'm nitpicking against a team that had one of the best defenses of the last 2 decades, but it's some of these glaring weaknesses. So I shouldn't say that. Some of these weaknesses became more glaring because of the way the Wolves got beat in the playoffs. And they need guys who can defend both on and off the ball. He's really good guarding at the point of attack. And it actually reminds me a little bit of Jalen Suggs. He's a little bigger, I think, than Jalen Suggs, but that type of a like a bulldog mentality. He's maybe a little too small to consistently guard, depending on who the, he's not going to necessarily guard Luka Doncic. Maybe he could. I don't think he's quite he might be the right combination. I don't know. Cause he's not a super athlete. He's not super sized, but he's not tiny either. He's 6'5" with 6'9" wingspan. He's got a decent build to him. And he's a good athlete. He's not a great athlete. So I think he could be a very good point of attack defender at the NBA level. And again, it's the tenacity more than anything else. But you layer into that, I have in my notes last year when they drafted him, it's hard to undersell how important his defensive IQ is. He's just a really intelligent player. Guarding the pick and roll, guarding at the point of attack, guarding the pick and roll ball handler. He was the best in the country in the collegiate season, 22, 23 in the NCAA. So, like, I'm not saying that it's complete plug and play into the NBA. Plus, you add in a year plus that he hasn't actually played a competitive basketball game. I mean, it would have been last March. He didn't play, like, he practiced with the G League a little at the end of the season this year, but he didn't step foot on a court in a game this season. So it's going to take a minute. And I'm not at all, like, on my graphic I have, could he earn a rotation spot? He's not going to be in the rotation on opening night. He's going to have to play in the G League some. But at some point next season, this is the exact sort of player that the Timberwolves want coming off their bench. I think he's a better natural defender than Nickeil Alexander-Walker. In fact, I think Alexander-Walker, there were moments last year where he really popped as a defender, and late the season before, remember against Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in the play-in, and against the, a few guys like that. But there were also moments where he didn't look great, and that includes in the Dallas series. Alexander-Walker struggled a little defensively. He's certainly a little bit longer, a little bit bigger than Jaylen Clark, but I see Jaylen Clark in that type of a role. He's not anywhere near as good of a shooter. And Alexander-Walker, this was the first year he was really above a league average 3-point shooter. So I'm not suggesting he takes Alexander-Walker's spot, but he's kind of that, like, he's not a point guard either, right? So he's a little undersized to play that kind of wing role that Alexander-Walker plays, even though Na does initiate offense at times for the Wolves. He's a bit of a, I hate the word tweener, and nowadays it doesn't make sense because so many teams are quote unquote positionless in a lot of ways. But Jaylen Clark's kind of that really an off-ball guard who's not a great shooter, but he's so good defensively that he can guard your point of attack, and you can hide a guy like Mike Conley a little bit. So I see him in that Alexander-Walker role minus the shooting, but effective as, like, almost taking those Monte Morris, Jordan McLaughlin minutes. And so, yeah, it's tough to play him in the playoffs because of the shooting issues. And I just spent, Monday or Tuesday on the show talking about how the Wolves need more shooting because Slow-Mo and Rudy are complete non-shooters. So this 9-man rotation, you can't have two non-shooters on the floor at the same time. And you don't ever really want more than one. And sometimes it's hard to deal with one if it's not a 5, right? And so with Kyle Anderson out there as a non-shooter, that's tricky. Now, Jaylen Clark, I think, could get there. The shot, at least in college, and who knows what it looks like now, rehabbing the Achilles, etc. It was stiff. It was a bit robotic. The free throw percentage isn't great either, and a lot of times that could be an indicator of future shooting success, or at least touch. He was 66% in college. He was 70% as a senior. He had a horrific year at the line the year before, 54%. But for his career, 3 years in college, 66%. However, if you go back and watch, Jaylen Clark actually had really good touch around the rim and in the paint with floaters. He actually did have a float game, which is nice to see. And he's a really solid cutter. And I feel like the feel he's got there is I don't think he's Josh Okogie, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okogie ended up with a decent-ish three-point shot at times. I don't even know that Jaylen Clark's there, but he's got more in-between game, more, I'm in a tough spot, so I got to put the ball on the floor and get a floater off at the end of the shot clock. Like, Josh Okogie's not doing that, or at least not doing it well. Jaylen Clark can do that. So I do think there's some offensive upside. I think it's limited. However, he's so good defensively. Like, I'm not exaggerating when I say, he was literally the best point of attack defender in college last season in 22-23. I'm not exaggerating when I say you add him to a group that includes Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Anthony Edwards, and of course, Jaden McDaniels. That's 4 of your 5 or 6 rotation guards / wings are, like, I would say again, we don't know how he comes back from the Achilles, but the point of attack defense translates from college to the NBA. So this is like, I literally think he could be one of the top point of attack defenders this year in the league, provided the Achilles recovery, goes okay. And of course, he's still very young. So I'm excited to see Jaylen Clark. I'm not at all suggesting he will be in the rotation at opening night, but I think the Wolves are looking at him as a potential Alexander Walker replacement next year, a potential, backup point guard minutes guy if he's not functionally running the point, and it's really like it's Alexander Walker if he plays with him, or Kyle Anderson's not on the team, but that sort of a situation, or likely won't be on the team next year, where somebody else is initiating, but Jaylen Clark is the smallest player on the floor because he could do all these other things well. And I think he's a good cutter too. I didn't mention that. I don't really have time to get into all that, but I think he's a good cutter, and I think he's got good enough size to be effective enough offensively, but he's going to be so good defensively. And I didn't even talk about his rebounding. I have to spend a second on that. He's a fantastic rebounder, and it's easy to say he's a guard, so it doesn't matter. It's not easy to say that because you shouldn't say that, but it wouldn't come up, and it didn't. I just spent 10 minutes talking about Jaylen Clark and didn't mention his rebounding, and shame on me. That's a huge thing. And we look at this Wolves team, and they ended up being a pretty good rebounding team this season, but a couple of years ago, just 2 years ago, even with Rudy on the team, they were one of the worst defensive rebounding teams in the league for most of the year. Some of that was saved by shipping out D'Angelo Russell and bringing in Mike Conley because Conley's a much better rebounder and continued to improve on the glass. I think McDaniels improved for stretches, and Rudy started playing better. So this team was a top 10 defensive rebounding team this year. But a huge part of that, like, variance between 20th and 10th is going to be your guards. And guys like Jaylen Clark, who I started here and I'll end here about Clark, he has a nose for the ball. He's going to find those loose balls and those in-between rebounds, those 50-50 balls. Those things matter, and they add up over the course of a season and potentially in a playoff series. And so Jaylen Clark being able to do those additional things are super important. Speaking of additional things, I want to talk about Josh Minott here next because he does all of the above. He has tons of activity, high-level activity. So I want to spend some time on Josh because of the 3 guys we're talking about today, I think he's got the best chance of being a rotation player next year for the Wolves. So we'll get to Josh Minott here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at Game Time. Game Time makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. So if you're in the Dallas area, if you're in the Boston area, check it out. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. The finals are a perfect example, but it's also not just the finals either. There's, of course, the Stanley Cup finals in the NHL. There are baseball games, and then there's also non-sports stuff, concerts, comedy, theater. I've gone to all of the above. My wife and I will go to all of the above. I'll go with my buddies to games. And the best place to get priority last-minute deals is, again, saving up to 60% off buying last minute on Game Time. They also have flash deals. You can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. They have zone deals. You can save even more when you choose a section and let Game Time choose the seats. Take the guesswork out of buying your tickets, especially for the NBA Finals with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDON NBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, let's talk about Josh Minott. Josh Minott was the Timberwolves' second-round pick a couple of years ago, and they technically traded for him on draft night. He was 15th pick of the second round in the 2022 draft, and I was really excited about him at the time, and I still am because of what he did in college. And the G League numbers are a bit more. There's just less of them because he hasn't actually played that many games in the G League. His first year, he played 20 total between the Showcase Cup and the regular season. Last year, he played just 12. And so I'm going to talk a little about college numbers because it's frankly a bigger sample for Minot, even though it was only one season. He played 33 games at Memphis. But we'll also talk a little G League. And I actually did a whole show on him toward the end of last offseason because I was excited for the possibility of him joining the rotation last year. And that was, I think I did this before we knew, exactly how the offseason would shake out. But with Kyle Anderson gone, there's a real chance that Minot, depending on who comes in from a minimum contract standpoint, and we talked about this earlier in the week, Monday or Tuesday, I think the way the Wolves fill the rotation, because pretend like Kyle Anderson's gone, and look at the top 10 of the rotation. Monte Morris, Jordan McLaughlin, Kyle Anderson are all gone. That's 2 rotation spots collectively. They also traded Shake Milton during the season and Troy Brown Jr. So it's actually probably 3 rotation spots when it was all said and done. Like toward the end of the regular season, like TJ Warren was kind of sort of in the rotation until they really shortened it. So regular season rotation, you're talking about a top 10. They really only have a top 7 right now. And it's the 7 guys that finished as the primary rotation guys, or it's the top 8 minus Kyle Anderson. They've got to fill 3 roles in that top 10. I do think one's a point guard. They may bring back Monte Morris or Jordan McLaughlin, and not to get too deep into the salary stuff, but it's going to have to be a minimum. They've got likely some of a mid-level exception up to maybe about $5 million to spend, and we'll get more into that later. So maybe that's Monte Morris. I don't know. But they're going to have to fill the Kyle Anderson role. And what I mean by that is somebody who, now he played a lot of 3 this year, but kind of that 3-4 role. And that's what Josh Minott is. He's like 6'8", 6'9". I mean, technically, like his draft measurements were 6'8" with a 6'11" wingspan. So he's the perfect size for a 3. He's not a good enough shooter, not even close, to really play the 3. But then again, so did Kyle Anderson. And the difference, of course, is Kyle Anderson could run the offense. He was a Swiss Army knife in that regard. And he was a savvy player on both ends of the floor. The offensive, the ability to distribute, to sit in the middle of the zone and distribute, to run the offense, to run, pick and roll, even if teams are sagging off him. He could do all of the above. Josh Minott, I don't think he can, at least coming out of, and again, we haven't seen him play much over the last year, but that's not in Josh Minott's skill set. He does all the other stuff well. I actually think he probably, I can't imagine he would talk and communicate as much as Slow-Mo defensively right away with the lack of experience. I mean, we're talking about a guy he's still only 21 years old, believe it or not. He played 1 year in college, was a young freshman, and has only played 2 years professionally. He doesn't turn 22 until basically Thanksgiving. So he's still painfully young. I'm not at all suggesting he can plug and play on defense like Kyle Anderson, but the superior athleticism and the similar size and the nose for the ball is going to play. Think about Kyle Anderson, but with athleticism defensively. And yes, there's a communication, like the quarterbacking the defense, which is primarily Rudy Gobert's job, but like talking, etc. I don't know that Josh Minott can't do it, but I think it would be naive to assume he could do it anywhere near to the level of Slow-Mo from day one. And that's, this is a playoff team. This is a conference finals team looking to fill that role. So do they pull a full Denver and say, we're going to let Jeff Green and Brian Brown, we're going to let them walk, or Bruce Brown and Jeff Green walk, and we're going to fill those spots with Julian Strother and Zeke Naji and Peyton Watson. I don't know. That might be what they have to do. And if that's the case, Josh Minott, I think, can be a reasonable facsimile of Kyle Anderson defensively, because I think he's flexible. I think he can guard 3s and 4s and some 2s. He's too slender to guard big 4s and 5s. He doesn't have quite as much thickness to him as Kyle Anderson does. But I think athletically and lengthwise and defensive IQ-wise, even if he's not going to communicate to the same level, I think he's a smart defensive player, and I think his activity level is huge. He was an awesome rebounder in college. I mean, he had a rebound rate and I said this last summer. I'm going to repeat what I had said last summer on the show. But if you take his rate-based stats from college and apply them to the NBA, which I understand isn't a thing, but to give some context for how good he was compared to the rest of college players, he would have been a top 30 rebounder in the NBA, given his rebound rate in college. He would have been a top 10 offensive rebound rate, or he would have had a top 10 offensive rebound rate in the NBA. He would have been ninth in last year's NBA offensive rebound rate. His block rate was over 5%, which also would have been top 10 in the NBA. And his steal rate at college would be the best steal rate in the NBA right now. It was over 3%. So Josh Minott does all the defensive activity stuff well with athleticism and size, and I believe a high defensive IQ. And it's the instincts that you can't teach. Combining instincts with activity really matters. And the Timberwolves don't have a lot of that. And that's going back to Jaylen Clark, who I talked about as a guard version of Josh Minott. He's only 3 inches shorter, but 3 inches shorter, 2 or 3 inches less on the wingspan. These guys are similar in that regard. And Tim Conley acquired both of them in the second round because they have activity, they have instincts, they have size for their position. Minott's a bit more athletic than Jaylen Clark, but these guys both have at least good athleticism. They don't have jump shots. They don't have the ability to run an offense. But what do you need on a playoff team? You need guys who are going to be those glue guys that know their role in a similar way as like an Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who obviously is a different player, but that type of a role. And Josh Minott, I think, could have a real chance at playing the Kyle Anderson role this year. I think, all the things I just listed are the reasons why I think he's got a shot. The rebounding, the steal rate, the offensive rebound rate, the activity level on offense. And we could talk about his shooting. I mean, in college, he barely shot any threes. He was 2 of 14 outside the arc in college. This year in the G League, he shot 30% in 8 regular season games and 18% in 4 Showcase Cup games. Overall in the G League, he's been like low 30% for over 2 seasons, and we'll call it about 34 games in the G League. He's hovering around the 33% from 3. So he's not going to make a lot of threes. And this year, for what it's worth, which is not worth much, but in the NBA, he was 4 of 10 on threes this season in garbage time minutes. If he develops a league average 3-point jump shot, then he's a rotation player. He just is. He's good at everything else, everything defensively. I would love for him to get a real shot this year. I see him as a first-round talent, and he just needs a little bit more opportunity, and I think he could plug that Kyle Anderson role, especially if the Wolves find somebody else they're comfortable with running offense and not having to rely on Kyle Anderson. I think Josh Minott, again, level of activity, he'll be good at the point of attack. I actually think he'll be better point of attack than Kyle Anderson because of the athleticism and similar length. It's the team defense stuff. It's the off-ball stuff that I talked about Jaylen Clark being so good at. Will Josh Minott be just as good? I tend to think he will because of the steal rate, the activity level, etc. But that's the question mark. And it absolutely is a leap of faith that came back to bite the Denver Nuggets this year. And I know that the Calvin Booth quote from, last fall of we're not trying to go back-to-back, we're trying to build a dynasty. And in theory, you play guys like that, and you make it to the second round and lose in year 2, then maybe you win a championship the following year because of the seasoning, the experience that these guys got over the course of the regular season. Christian Brown and Peyton Watson got in the offseason, the playoffs. That's the school of thought. And it's a scary thing to make that leap, especially when you didn't win the championship. Like the Nuggets were coming off a championship. The Wolves need to retool and reload. But I think Josh Minott could give you some rotation minutes in the regular season next year. I'm not talking playoffs. We'll see what it looks like come next April. But I think he could be a rotation guy for the Wolves this fall. And I'm excited for the chance to see some Josh Minott in the rotation. All right, we'll close today's show with a first-round pick from last year, Wendell Moore Jr. We'll get to Wendell Moore Jr. here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million members. It's the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action where you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more player stats for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. With PrizePicks, you can turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make a PrizePicks lineup in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 players' stat projections, and you're locked in. If you're looking for promotions, PrizePicks has got you covered every week, from lowering select players' stat projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chance of getting a win, to getting your entry fees back if you have a losing lineup on Fridays. Plus, there's always action on PrizePicks. It's the perfect time to try out something new. Basketball is winding down, of course, but you can try out esports this month for every Wednesday and Saturday in June. If your lineup doesn't win, you get your entry fee back. You can choose from Counter-Strike 2, Call of Duty, League of Legends, and more. Download the app today. Use the code LOCKDOWNNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app today. Use the code LOCKDOWNNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Okay, let's close this out with Wendell Moore Jr. And, of course, Wendell Moore was the Timberwolves' first-round pick last season. And, well, one of 2 first-round picks. Of course, they also drafted Walker Kessler, who was traded just a couple of weeks later. But Wendell Moore, the way I described him when the Timberwolves drafted him, of course, he played, 3 years at Duke or 2 years? 2 years at Duke. Is that right? I think he played 3 years at Duke. Hang on, I'm going to make sure I have that right. Yeah, 3 years at Duke. The way I described Wendell Moore Jr. when the Timberwolves drafted him 2 years ago is as a two-way role player, which is kind of a goofy phrase. But what I mean by that is I think he's got a relatively low ceiling. I don't know that Wendell Moore Jr. ever becomes a starting caliber player in the NBA. And I thought there was a shot at that when he was drafted. And maybe there still is, but he's only played so far in his NBA career, 54 games over 2 seasons. He played even less this year. The G League stuff has been kind of meh. But I'll get to that in a second. What I saw him as a prospect when the Timberwolves drafted him was he could be a 3-and-D type player, because he can legitimately be good at both things. He was 41% on threes his last year in college, and he was 52% on catch and shoot threes. He's also really good defending the pick and roll, which was maybe his best skill coming out of college. And again, there's a reason why he went in the first round, because that skill set of guarding, of making threes and defending and guarding and pick and roll, especially in today's NBA, is super important and super valuable. I had one of my comps for him, and I know I brought up Josh Okogie earlier because I'm thinking of recent Timberwolves comps to try and make this translatable to a Timberwolves audience. I would think like a bigger Josh Okogie with a jumper was what I saw him as. Now, we haven't seen him enough at the NBA level, and the Timberwolves are much better than when the Wolves had Josh Okogie. I mean, I guess that was the Tibbs year, so it was, they were good. But Josh Okogie ended up being a rotation guy fairly quickly because of the activity level. I don't know that Wendell Moore Jr. has that same, I don't know that he doesn't, but I'm not convinced he has the same motor as Josh Okogie. But being a little bit bigger and having a 3-point shot, in theory, should help him quite a bit. Now, in the G League so far, he's been kind of 34-ish% from 3, so a little below league average. It's, you'd like to see him shoot the ball better there. And certainly his first 3 years at Duke, he wasn't quite as, I should say his first 2 years, he was 30% in his junior year, 21% outside the arc, limited action as a freshman. But his final year, again, 41.3% from 3 and 52% catch and shoot. So maybe that was the outlier. And we don't know. We don't know what he looks like in practice necessarily, and that's not the same as a game. But the G League 3-point shooting, you'd like that to be better, to have more confidence. I think where we've gotten lost a bit with him, because, again, if he can be 3-and-D, he should be a rotation guy. But at his size, at 6'5", you'd like him to be able to initiate a bit more offense or be elite at one of the above things. And I think he's just okay as a 3-point shooter and just okay as a defender at the NBA level with good, not great athleticism, good, not great size. And going back to the first segment of Jaylen Clark is elite already as an on-ball defender. So you can deal with him being a little bit undersized for the position and not necessarily being able to run the offense. I think he's a better defender than Wendell Moore Jr., even if Moore is a better shooter. So that's why I think Jaylen Clark and the Bulldog mentality, the hard-nosed defense, I think those things are are going to give him an edge over Wendell Moore Jr. I think Clark has a better shot at a rotation role this year than Wendell Moore. Wendell Moore's under contract. The Wolves picked up his option last October for this year. He's got one more rookie contract option in October for the Wolves to pick up. I floated on Monday. Is it possible they don't? Or I guess it would have been Tuesday because of the contract crunch. It's going to be over $4 million next year. Now the cap will go up again. I think they probably do pick it up because he still was a first-round pick. He probably has some trade value. I think probably more than Jarrett Culver did a couple of years ago. I hate that I brought him up, but he probably has a little more trade value than that. I think they probably do pick it up, but he could be the rare first-round pick that doesn't have that third or fourth year option picked up by the team. That, again, is due right near the beginning of the regular season. So we'll see. It's just clear the Wolves haven't been super impressed. They made it a point to go out and get Troy Brown and Shake Milton and bring back Nickeil Alexander-Walker instead of give Wendell Moore a shot. I think I've always said since they drafted him, his upside was limited, but the hope was he could be a plug-and-play rotation guy for this team that had designs on making the playoffs. And now they're a conference finals team. And if you have a guy that's been a pro for 2 years and hasn't shown you enough in practice for the G League, like the G League numbers are not positive. All the advanced metrics are worse this year in slightly more G League action. And again, it's still, we're talking a small enough sample, like 16 total G League games. It's not really enough to get, like, win shares aren't going to tell you a lot there, but the assist rate went down. And actually you could say the same thing about Josh Minott, like the usage goes up. And so we saw assist rate go down and turnover rate go up. That was the case for these guys. Actually, that wasn't the case for Moore. The turnover rate didn't go up, but like they're doing less on the glass in the G League. You'd like to see Wendell Moore dominate the G League if he's going to have a legit shot at doing anything at the NBA level this year. So I have tempered expectations. Again, on draft night, I saw him as a ceiling of a good bench player, a 3-and-D type guy. I think that's with a small chance ceiling of a starting caliber player. Now I think his ceiling definitely is a role player. I think he can still get there because I think the 3-point shooting and the defense can still play. I just think he's not going to be above Jaylen Clark or Josh Minott on the depth chart or whatever point guard they bring in at minimum contract, if it's McLaughlin or Monte Morris or somebody else. I think he's perpetually the 11th guy for the Wolves. And I wouldn't be shocked if he was lumped into some sort of trade to try and free up a roster spot or cap space at some point because there is still potentially some bench value there. And he was a first-round pick, and he's only had 2 years in the NBA. He was a 3-year college guy, so we're talking about a guy who's going to turn 23 in September, so still relatively young. And whoever trades for him would get 2 years on the contract. So, maybe I don't know that they're going to trade him for a future first-round pick, but that's possible. I mean, look, this year's draft is not good, so there could be a team that, whether or not they have a pick this year, is saying like, hey, we're not going to get a quote-unquote real first-round pick. Let's trade for Wendell Moore Jr. and trade a future pick with protections, or I don't know, I guess it wouldn't be probably with protections. Maybe it's a late first-round pick that converts into a second or something, right? Like some sort of weird trade like that for the Wolves to free up the guaranteed money to a first-round player and a roster spot. I could see that happening, but obviously hope the best for Wendell Moore, and there's still a shot he gets a chance this year, depending on how things shake out. It's just been a bit of a, we'll call it a nondescript first 2 years at the NBA level. All right, Friday, we'll continue this series. We'll get into this year's highest draft pick for the Wolves this last year. That was Leonard Miller. We'll also talk about Jordan McLaughlin, and we'll talk a little about TJ Warren, both guys who finished the year on the roster for the Wolves. We're going to skip over guys that aren't on the team anymore. So we'll talk about those guys on Friday's show. Of course, we'll keep you updated if there's any breaking Wolves news on the ownership front or, rumors, etc. That, of course, will always supersede the player review series. But we are rolling now. We've got another 12 players or so to get to. I don't know, 10 or 11 players to get to here in the series. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon at Fire TV, and you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.